All right, what is up, y'all? Welcome back for our first video recording extension activity for Friday of the first full week, but week 2 of the second semester. With our new model of live classes first, video second, as opposed to last semester's was video first, live classes second. We have a cool, unique opportunity to use these videos on Fridays to really hammer home the big ideas and to conclude some of the things we're talking about in our live session. So our live session this week talked in great length about free market capitalism and industrialization and vertical and horizontal integration and the ways in which big businesses consolidate their control over specific industries, whether they be banking, right, with J.P. Morgan, or railroads with Jay Gould and Vanderbilt, oil with Rockefeller, steel with Carnegie. The way in which those who are rich maintain total control of an industry. And we talked about some of the consequences of industrialization on society, some of the positive consequences, like the increase in the standard of living for many, the decrease in the cost of goods. We also talked about some of the negative consequences, like the exploitation of labor and the replaceability of labor. So today we're going to really talk about how society responds to these changes, right? So this is a really important conversation that's going to be really meaningful to understand, contextually speaking, this entire time period. And when I say the way society responds, I mean this through a couple of the different avenues. Avenue one, we're going to talk about some of the justifications, some of the ways in which those who are rich say, yeah, we got rich, but this is why it's okay. That's avenue one. There'll be a couple of different routes there. Avenue two is the way in which the working classes are going to respond, largely through the ideas of collective bargaining and labor unions coming together to try to assert control that they would not have had independently or by themselves. So today's conversation is called The Responses to Industrialization. Make sure you have your handout at the ready so that you can fill in the necessary responses, as well as respond to it's not a thesis statement for today's assignment. It is a short answer question with a little cartoon that I think you'll appreciate very, very much. So without any further conversation, make sure you watch the entirety of this video. Make sure you spend your time, pause it if you need to, take your notes if you need to. Second semester especially, these videos are going to be vital in ensuring that you are ready for your AP test, which is coming up in just 4 months. So let's get going. So as we see from 1870 to 1910, this broader time period that we're talking about, the workforce in the United States is going to change drastically. But first, the first thing I want to point your attention to is the total labor force. Right? In 1870, we have about 13 million laborers in America, 30 people that are working in America. By 1910, just 40 short years later, it's 37 million. So we see a 3x increase in the number of workers in America, which is just a drastic change for such a short amount of time. That's change one. Change two is what type of work they're doing. We see in 1870, half of the workers in America are working in farms, in agriculture. By 1910, that's only 31%. So we see 20% decrease from agriculture in 1870 to agriculture in 1910. And where does that then get increased? That gets increased in manufacturing and construction, industrial type work, as well as commerce, trade type work. So we see these are the changes that we're talking about. As America industrializes, that means that our workforce is also adapting and evolving. Less people working on farms, more people working in factories, which then probably means less people who are independent and self-sufficient, and more people who are considered laborers for somebody else. So these are really important changes to help us understand what's happening during this Gilded Age, this Industrial Revolution. And this is one perspective on what exactly is taking place. So I'll have you just take a moment and pause the video if you could. Take a look at this cartoon. Answer for me, what's the context? What's the background that makes this cartoon make sense? What are the events that have led to this situation? And what's the point of view? What is this cartoon arguing about the workforce, the everyday people who are doing the work in America? So I will point your attention to the sign on the wall, to the guy's outfit, to the way in which these people are looking, to the kind of work that they're doing. Just things to think about as we begin this conversation about what workers do in response to the conditions that they find themselves in. So, long story short, working conditions in the Industrial Revolution era are atrocious, are very, very poor. And it doesn't really matter if you're working in mines, in factories, etc. Like, working conditions are really not good. Miners are often suffering through fires in the mines, gas leaks in the mines, explosions or collapses of the mines. So mine workers are having a really hard time. Factory workers are having a really hard time with dangerous jobs, gas leaks, chemicals. We're dealing with new industries that we don't really understand how damaging they might be to the environment and to those that are working. So the working conditions themselves are terrible, but also the way in which these workers are treated is terrible. Workers are asked to work between 12 and 14 hours a day, usually 6 days a week. Long hours, no benefits, no paid time off. If you got hurt at work, there's no workers' compensation like we have today, where your workplace has to pay for you to get the healthcare you need if you get hurt at work, because it's on their watch. So people are dying at work, and their families are getting no benefit. People are getting hurt at work and then losing their jobs for getting hurt at work, and their families are getting no benefit. So really, the working class is having the biggest brunt of the negative consequences of industrialization. Just some data for you. In 1882, for example, it's one quite deadly year for the working classes. About 675 workers are killed every week at work, which you would assume like that's where you can go and just do your job. No, 675 workers are killed at work each week. And between 1881 all the way to 1900, when we're going to enter a new era that we'll talk about next unit, about 35,000 workers are killed on average every year, which is just an astounding number of the working classes that are killed. And the problem is that there's just no consequences. Let's talk about why. Reason one, there's no government accountability. The government's not telling factory owners you need to treat people better and do X, Y, and Z. The government's not stepping into a regulatory role to regulate these businesses. Reason two, sadly, in this era, workers are replaceable. Workers are very, very replaceable. And part of that comes from scientific management and Taylorism that we talked about in our live session, the idea of training one person to do one small task in a bigger task so that all they have to worry about is doing that one small task. Well, if all you're doing is one small task over and over and over and over and over again, well then, if you're not there anymore, we just have somebody new do that one small task. The labor is very unskilled, as it's called, because you're not doing the whole job, you're doing one small part of a job. So because of that, the workers are replaceable. Also because of immigration, the workers are replaceable because there's such a ready labor force. There's so many people that are looking for work that the ownership class can kind of have their way and pay you whatever they want, because if you don't want the job, somebody else will. Here's some more pictures for you to help kind of understand what I am talking about here. We see a good amount, as you see in these pictures, of child labor. There's a very famous picture on the top right of kids leaving their shift in the mine, kids working here, more factory workers, kids here. So we see a ton of child labor. This is on the slide before. We see a good amount of packed, densely populated factory-type jobs, like is shown there. And that's also going to contribute to what we see later in this era into the next, as we try to get kids out of work and improve working conditions. So we see a ton of child labor here in the Gilded Age. Kids are working as farm laborers, which isn't entirely new necessarily. But what is a little more new is kids working in mining and kids working in factories. Because kids are smaller, they can work on smaller equipment, get into smaller spaces in the mines, and that smallness of children is exploited. We have here in this picture a good example of kids that are barefoot working on this big assembly line of some sort. Kids are also working in street trades, things like newspaper delivery, message carrying, couriers to take messages and mails back and forth, on bicycles and other ways as well. So there's a ton of kids working. In 1870, 1 out of every 8 kids in the U.S. worked. So 5 years after the Civil War, more than 10% of the children under the age of 12 in the United States are working. But 30 years later, you'd expect like the country to continue getting better. 30 years later, it's 1 in 5. So 20% of kids are actually working in manual labor jobs. Overall, in this really heavily industrialized period of 1890 to 1910, about 18%, we round up to 20 if you want, but 20% of all kids ages 10 to 15 are working in jobs. And we're not talking about like you go to school and you have a job after school. Like I work, 2 days a week at the Little Caesars. Like, no, we're talking about kids that are working 5-6 days a week, full-time jobs. Why? Because it's necessary to support their families. Because their families aren't making any money in their factory jobs either. Because they're not working because they want a little bit of extra money in their pocket. They're working because of they're working for survival. So you might be thinking, like, how does America, the United States of America, justify having kids have to work, instead of being in school, having all these terrible working conditions, having all these people dying at work? How do we sit back and be like, yeah, this is okay? I mean, you might be asking that question, or you might be asking or saying, of course we think it's okay, because look at the rest of the things that are happening in America. Here we are 120 years later. You're also correct. So there's two big justifications that I need you to know. And I need you to know them both, and I need you to know how they're similar, and I need you to know how they're different. The first is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism. And social Darwinism is going to be a next step of Charles Darwin's theories of evolution. Now, it's not a science class. I'm not going to pretend this is a science class. I'll know a whole hell of a lot about science. But what I do know is evolution says you either adapt, you evolve, or you die. This philosophy that is seen in nature is then applied to social classes in an industrialized society. And it's going to use the exact same logic of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. That either if you are the most fit in society, you'll do well. If you're less fit, you won't do well. And it's going to be championed by a guy named Herbert Spencer. Herbert Spencer is going to first popularize this idea. He's an important name to be able to use for SFI in this unit. It'll later be picked up by a Yale professor named William Graham Sumner and championed quite aggressively as a justification for why society is as unequal as it is. And the basic argument is that wealth, getting rich, is because you worked hard and you're brilliant. Because you are better than everybody else, that's why you got rich. But the flip side of that coin is that those who aren't rich, the poor, are the poor also because they did not work hard and they're not smart. Right? The opposite issue. If you're going to tell me that the rich people are rich because they're the most fit, then therefore the poor people are the least fit. So it's this argument which takes out of account every other element of human nature and just says they're rich because they're good, they're poor because they're bad. All right? And we still see this element of conversation present in many realms of U.S. society today. But it's also then fueled and influenced by a couple of other factors. One, laissez-faire economics that we talked about last week and this week as well. This belief that government should be left alone, the business should be left alone from the government. And if we say like, oh, the government doesn't need to get involved because the rich are rich because they're good, the poor are poor because they're bad, the government can't fix that, just leave people alone, that's a good justification. Second reason is racism. Right? Many of the people that are working in these conditions that are the poorest in America are from Eastern Europe, are Jews, are from Asia, are former slaves. So therefore, racially speaking, it becomes an easy way to justify this. Nativism is another reason. Most of the working class, not most, but a good chunk of the working class is recent immigrants. And anti-immigrant sentiment is going to say like, yeah, well, they're poor because they're immigrants and they shouldn't have come here, yada, yada, yada. Imperialism and eugenics play a role as well. Eugenics is going to become a quite popularized form of science that's going to try to justify this. That's going to say things like white people, Anglo-Saxon people are more intelligent, and here's scientific reason to show they have bigger foreheads or whatever the heck it is. We'll talk about eugenics a little bit more in period 7. And this will all be backed up by the Horatio Alger myth. The Horatio Alger myth, which is cool SFI for A-Push as well. The Horatio Alger myth. Horatio Alger is an author. He's an author who publishes a series of books, funny enough, called the Ragged Dick series, because they're about a ragged little boy named Dick, short for Richard, of course. And Ragged Dick works real hard. He's a small boy who's orphaned. He's in the city. He works a bunch of odd jobs, and then he gets other jobs, and he gets other jobs. The next thing you know, he's wealthy and well off, and life is good. But this myth is just that. It's a myth, right? Like nobody's actually doing this in the United States in the Gilded Age. They're just working these factory jobs and working these factory jobs and working these factory jobs and then dying. So that myth becomes a justification. Like, see, like people like Ragged Dick here can work as hard as he can and work in society. So can you, even though that's not in fact true at all. So that's the first justification. As long as you understand Darwinism from a scientific standpoint, you'll understand it from a social scientific standpoint. The second justification is the gospel of wealth. And the gospel of wealth is going to be an ideology, a perspective, an approach to the world that's going to be championed by first Andrew Carnegie and later other large industrialists as well. The whole perspective, the whole philosophy will be pulled from an article written by Carnegie. And the basic argument here, if I'm going to make it as simplistic as possible for this year's purposes, the basic argument here is that rich people can do the best work in society by using their money to provide resources for their communities. Meaning, like, Carnegie's going to say, like, yeah, I got rich. Well, how did he get rich? By not paying his workers, by having terrible working conditions, by screwing his competition, by screwing his consumer, by a bunch of unsavory tactics. Carnegie gets rich. But then he says, don't worry. Like, my job now is to bestow resources to my community, to bestow charity. So what Carnegie's going to do, and others like him, like Rockefeller as well, is Carnegie's going to use his money to start a university, Carnegie Mellon, still very exclusive university today, to fund a ton of libraries all over the country so that communities can have access to books and to literature, to fund scholarships, to create Carnegie Hall, one of the most famous music venues in the world in New York City, to do all these things that, if you think about it, they aren't exactly handouts to poor people, but they are opportunities that people can take if they have the initiative. So Carnegie says all revenue, all money that's generated beyond what you need, which is hilarious for a guy that sells his company for $100 million. All the money generated beyond your own need should be used for the good of the community, to improve the community around you. And I want you to think of the gospel of wealth not as a handout, but as a ladder. Not as a handout, but as a ladder, so that people who are less fortunate can climb with a little bit of hard work themselves, instead of a handout, which is just like, here's money, go do with it what you want. Now, this is a very white paternalistic approach, certainly, but he does say that in bestowing charity, in passing out charity, the main consideration should be to help people who want to help themselves, right? To give the means, to provide help for those who desire to improve, to give those who desire to use the aids that they can use, to assist, but not to do everything for people. So neither the individual, neither the person, nor the human race is improved by almsgiving, by handouts. So in a sense, this is like social Darwinism 1.5, right? Which says, like, yes, they're poor, but if we give them resources and they take advantage of them, they can work their way up as well. So both of these two justifications are similar in some ways, are different in the other. The gospel of wealth is what Carnegie is going to profess to his death, as he does, in fact, give away an absolute ton of his money, and many of his charities and foundations are still active in passing out resources and scholarships and opportunities today. But then we then ask ourselves, take a step back, like, well, how did he get rich on the backs of the working class? So, make of that what you will. So Carnegie, as we know, pays his employees terribly. Pays his employees absolutely terribly. He does not allow his employees to join unions, which I'll talk about in a second. So it's like, oh, that's terrible. Look at this guy. What a terrible man. But he's a huge philanthropist who gives money to New York City libraries all over the country. If you want to, Carnegie libraries, you can still see a list today of all the libraries that are created because of grants from Carnegie's foundation, colleges, performing arts institutions, etc. So as we see here he is he's of course Scottish by birth, with his American flag kilt on, just throwing money around to resources that need it, which is of course one way to justify how in fact you got rich. So those are the two main justifications that are worth noting: social Darwinism, gospel of wealth. We'll talk next week about a different thing, a third element called the social gospel, which is important also, not quite the same as those other two. But I don't want to hit you with all three of those at once, because that tends to get confusing. But we'll save that for next week. So the main way that the working class can respond to the fact that they are replaceable, to the fact that they are paid poorly, to the fact that they're doing unskilled labor, all these important factors, the way they can respond is in numbers. The way they can respond is in numbers. Because if one worker is replaceable, sure. What are a lot of workers? Less replaceable, right? Like if I went to Miss Dagnino and I was like, Miss Dagnino, give me a raise or I quit. I mean, I hope she'd give me a raise. I'm not going to do this. It's not the way teaching works. But let's just pretend for a second. I was like, give me a raise or I quit. She's going to be like, well, then quit. Because I can get another teacher to do your job, which I disagree with, of course. And I'm sure you do too. But, play with me along for here just a moment. Why can she say, go ahead and quit? Because it's just one person. Now, if every teacher at the school went to Miss Dagnino and says, give us a raise or we quit, different story. That's the way labor unions work. It's the idea that we're all laboring together, and now we are a union that's going to do what's good for the good of all. Now, a couple of things that are worth noting, and I gave you a quick table in your handout. Make sure you're able to fill it in because labor unions are a big element of this unit, this course as a whole. 4 big causes. Cause 1, the de-skilling and the devaluing of labor. All right, this comes from Taylorism, the fact that labor is replaceable because you're not building the whole ship, you're just putting on one sail, right? Or you're just hammering in one nail on every ship. This de-skilling of labor leads to labor being less valuable, and thus labor is then more replaceable. There we are again. 2, working conditions. They suck. They're terrible. They're dangerous. They're poor. They're unhealthy. That also then includes working hours, the fact that shifts are long. 3, labor unions are caused by the use of immigrants in labor because immigrants make the work even more replaceable because there's so many of them coming. 4th, the pay. 4th is the pay. Because the working class is paid so poorly, they're going to argue that they should be paid more. They should be given benefits like money if they get hurt at work, et cetera, et cetera. We see in this cartoon here on the right-hand side. It's a good one. All these laborers are marching, right? And we see they're comparing the laboring classes of the Gilded Age to slavery, right? Slavery in the past, slavery in the present. And their purpose is going to be quite simple. Quite simple. Their purpose is going to be to collectively bargain. It's a very important phrase. I need you to know it for this unit, to collectively bargain, meaning we're going to negotiate. That's what bargaining is. We're going to negotiate as a whole. We're going to negotiate collectively, right? Demanding what every labor union for the rest of time will demand, say it with me, higher wages, shorter working days, better working conditions, right? More money, fewer days work or fewer hours worked, and safer work. That's the labor union's job. Now, they're going to use a couple of tactics, a couple of methods to try to get their way, to try to impose their will on an industrialized society. The first is political action, right? Asking their politicians to do their work for them, to pass laws to support them. We see this as an example in the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Which the miners in the Western states are asking Congress to act against immigrants because immigrants are making it harder for them to earn money. In that case, the laborers are successful. Other tactics are the attempted creation of closed shops, which means creating factories and industries in which only people who are in a union can get hired. When they don't get their way, doing slowdowns, like slowing the work to try to add some negotiation weight. Picketing, boycotting, going on strike is maybe the most popular one. Going on strike, meaning all the workers in one factory are going to walk out and say, we're not working until we get our 50-cent a day raise, whatever it is, as well as sabotaging of equipment. So those are some of the tactics they're going to use. There's 3 unions you should know. All 3 serve a slightly different purpose, which is important. The first is the Knights of Labor. They're really the first big one. They're formed in 1869 by Uriah Stevens, later led by a really important name in the Knights of Labor named Terence Powderly. And they're a unique union in that they are really, for the most part, open to everybody. Anybody in the working class can join the Knights of Labor. They're open to black workers, women, most immigrants, Catholics, skilled workers, unskilled workers, semi-skilled workers. They are quite open. Instead of like a specific union for a factory or a job or this, they're just a laboring classes union. And they're arguing for a couple things, very clear: an 8-hour workday, so shorter workday, and this one makes a little bit of sense: child labor laws, right? Laws that make it illegal for kids to work. Because if you make it illegal for kids to work, then there's more jobs for adults, and therefore there's less people to compete with. They're going to use their main tactic is arbitration, asking for negotiation. Arbitration is the way in which two sides bring in a neutral third party. So the working class, the ownership class, they bring in a third party to act as an impartial arbiter in a workplace dispute. And in 1886, they have almost 1 million members, 700,000 members. By the mid-1880s, demonstrates how quickly they grow as a union. 1886, the year where the Knights of Labor were at their peak, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. The AFL is going to be founded, and they are going to be skilled worker union. So workers that have a specific skill. Like today you'd consider like plumbers, right? Or iron workers or electricians, right? Those are skilled work. Here, they're just craft unions of skilled workers. They'll be founded by Samuel Gompers, the Gomp, as we call him in APUSH. Fun dude, Samuel Gompers. He's a freaking legend. And their big goals are what's called like bread and butter, right? The things that make life better. Better wages, shorter working hours, better working conditions for those in their union. They will use much more so than arbitration, collective bargaining, which is more successful, more effective for them because they are more skilled workers, and thus they have a little bit more bargaining power because they're a little bit harder to replace. They will also use strikes. And the AFL will become quite closely associated with the Democratic Party. The AFL will become quite closely linked with the priorities of the Democrats, so much so that much like before the Civil War, right, the urban working class that comes from the market revolution into the industrial revolution, the urban working class will almost exclusively vote Democrat, which again shouldn't surprise us because we know in this Gilded Age time period that the Republicans are the party that's more aligned with big business, and the Democrats are the party that are more aligned with immigrants and the working class. Now, the third of these unions worth noting is the most extreme of all of them, the International Workers of the World, IWW, also called the Wobblies. They're established in 1905, so a little bit later in a slightly different time that we'll talk about in period 7. But they're founded by Big Bill Haywood, Big Bill, and later led by Eugene Debs, a very, very, very famous activist, labor activist, and socialist that we'll talk about a lot into the 19-teens and 20s next unit. But they're a little more extreme because they're made up of socialists and anarchists. They are similar to the Knights of Labor in that they're also open to minorities and women, skilled, unskilled, farmers, sharecroppers. Their goal is to make one big union for the working classes worldwide, right? So instead of being specific about one industry or the other, their goal is just to unite the working classes against capital, against big business, against the ruling elites. One big union and worker solidarity. Doesn't matter what industry you're in, how skilled you are, what color you are, their goal is worker solidarity, which means togetherness, all for one, one for all. And their goal is to end wage labor, to end capitalism, and to create more of a workers' utopia in the world. They're willing to use boycott strikes as well, like the other twos are. But they're also willing to use extreme direct action of like sabotage and violence. So those are the 3 unions to know, or 3 unions to know. Of those 3 unions, I'm going to give you a couple of the key strikes that are worth noting. The first is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, which is quite important politically, economically, socially. And almost every strike is going to be caused by the same thing, and that's going to be wage cuts. In general, in the Gilded Age, people aren't going on strike because they want more money. People are going on strike because they're now being paid less money. Big thing to help us understand and contextualize their frustrations. The strike will actually last from my birthday. Hey, happy birthday, Winch. Thanks, guys. Also Bastille Day. Happy Bastille Day, July 14th. All the way into early September of 1877. Now, you should note, 1877, the same year as the Compromise of 1877. So Rutherford B. Hayes is president. Of course, the country is kind of on edge over the North versus South tension. Now we have this big strike. And the strike is caused by wage cuts. So people are getting less money. People are getting laid off. And because people are getting laid off, those that are working for less money and being told to work longer hours. And this is with 2 different railroads, largely like in Pennsylvania in the Northeast, the B&O Railroad, as well as the Pennsylvania Railroad. The strike first begins at a train line in West Virginia and Maryland, and eventually is going to spread across the Northeast and the Midwest. It becomes a huge strike because it's across these rail lines that these two railroads serve. The strikers, as you can see, they're on strike for a better part of a month and a half. When they're not getting their way, are going to resort to violence, to vandalism, to rioting in their attempt to get the ownership classes to give them the money they think they deserve. The response is very key. As President Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, our boy, is going to file injunctions or legal ordinances to stop the insurrections. And when that doesn't work, he sends federal troops, which makes the violence worse as strikers are killed and soldiers are injured, and it creates quite the chaos. The thing to note, though, that's going to happen with every single one of these strikes in the Gilded Age is the government steps in. This is what you need to know. The government steps in on behalf of industry, not on behalf of the workers. So here Hayes steps in, not to make the railroads pay their workers, to make the workers go back to work. That's the big through line or the continuity for these Gilded Age labor unrest examples. Now, the impact of the railroad strike is that workers and labor unions realize they need to have a stronger, tighter series of unions to actually get the change they want. But state and federal legislation is passed, which limits unions and helps free the government to use either the National Guard later or the Army, like in this case, to put down these potential conflicts quite quickly. Rutherford B. Hayes, of course, Republican president, who the Republicans side with, big business, especially now after Reconstruction, in which they're less worried about civil rights, obviously. Hayes says the strikes have been put down by force. But now, for the real remedy, can't something be done by education of the strikers? Can we educate the strikers and by judicious control of the capitalists? Can we do something as a government that helps the strikers and regulates the industry to try to help everybody? Right? He asks, by wise general policy to end or diminish this evil? The railroad strikers, he says, as a rule, are good men, sober, intelligent, industrious. The answer, though, is no, because the Republican Party, despite Hayes' proclamation here that something should be done to rein in these industrialists, to control these capitalists that aren't paying their workers well, the Republican Party in general is going to be very, very unwilling to act on this front because of the influence of big business in politics. That's the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The next one worth noting is the Haymarket Riot of 1886, which is actually going to begin on May Day, which is a holiday still celebrated to this day to celebrate the laboring classes. It starts as a strike of farm workers who go on strike here in Chicago. May 3rd, the police come to protect the strikers. A fight breaks out. Unfortunately, the next day, anarchists plan a demonstration against police brutality. These anarchists or somebody associated with them leaves a pipe bomb that kills 7 police officers. The response is the police kill 4 people protesting. All kinds of craziness goes on. It's quite the unfolding of events in a 4-day window. Now we have 7 dead police officers. We have 4 dead protesters from what started as a peaceful protest. The government reacts quite strongly, puts 8 anarchists on trial for murder. They are convicted almost immediately of murder, despite the fact that there's no evidence against them. 4 of them are then hung. 1 commits suicide in jail, and 3 are eventually pardoned by the governor. The problem here is that what started as a Knights of Labor harvesting workers, like peaceful strike, is then turned into this chaotic, it sounds a little bit like our past summer. What starts as a peaceful strike is then infiltrated by a bunch of other forces. It turns into a much bigger, much more dangerous event. And then the public opinion blames the labor unions for the violence that unfolds because it's the pipe bomb that explodes that leads to all these events. So the Haymarket Riot's actually going to lead to a ton of criticism from the public of labor unions for advocating violence in their mind. And it's also going to really lead to the beginning of the downfall of the Knights of Labor because they're then associated with all of this. This is, of course, 1886. 1886, and if you went back to right here, I told you 1886 was the peak of the Knights of Labor when they have 700,000 members. That number will decrease quite quickly afterwards because of public opinion and the Haymarket Riot. So as we can see, there's my map. There's my chart, excuse me. Knights of Labor increased significantly in their influence and numbers to 1886, and then they're going to decline pretty steadily. Whereas the American Federation of Labor, because it's not open to everybody, it's more of a skilled labor union, is going to gradually climb and climb and climb for the rest of this century. Now, one of the bigger strikes, and one of the ones that I think causes the most social ripples of unrest, is the Homestead Strike. And the Homestead Strike is going to take place at a Carnegie Steel plant. Now, Carnegie himself is not here. He is in Scotland. He's trying to insulate himself from some of the ugly things that are taking place in his factories. And the person responsible for this is actually a man named Henry Clay Frick. Henry Clay Frick, of course, named for our old friend, 12-time nominee, 0-time winner, Henry Clay for president. Maybe he can run for president in 2024. But Henry Clay Frick is the manager of Carnegie Steel, and he cuts wages. He makes their wages go down to try to maximize profits. And he's trying to weaken the steel workers union that are in the Carnegie factory, trying to weaken the steel worker unions. Frick orders a lockout of the union, meaning he refuses to let the union workers work and tries to hire scabs, which are replacements, to come in instead because he's trying to weaken the union's ability to get what they want. The striking workers, unfortunately, aren't down with that, and they barricade themselves in front of the steel plant. They really take over the plant. Frick then hires the Pinkerton Detectives, which is like a private for-hire police force that rich people use to enforce order when they want to. He hires the Pinkertons. They come to disperse the strikers. The strikers fight them off. And eventually, what do you know? The Pennsylvania State Militia, like every one of these strikes, the government sides with the industrialists. The Pennsylvania State Militia shows up, ends the strike by force. Some laborers are killed. The strike fails, and the union is broken. The impact of this, the Steel Workers Union is weakened because they've tried this giant strike and they have failed. But this also does really tarnish Carnegie's reputation. He tries to have this reputation as a man of the people who tries real hard to just do the right thing and follow God's will. And this event, given front page news nationwide, as you see here on the front of Harper's Weekly, is going to be quite detrimental to his reputation. I do want you to watch the video clip. It's from a really good series that I recommend called The Men Who Built America. There's some good clips in there to help you visualize what's happening. But I linked you right there in your handout to a short clip that shows a reenactment of the Homestead Steel Strike, so you can kind of get your mind like what this looks like on the ground level. I encourage you, it's only 5 minutes long. Watch it. It's a freaking video. It's from History Channel. It'll make you enjoy it some. So everywhere on this map that we see this orange color is a county that reports at least a strike from 1870 to 1900. And as we can see, the strikes are largely located in the northern states where the factories are, and the western states where the mines are, which would make sense. And all the major strikes are here in the industrialized Northeast that I told you about when I showed you the 3 different circles of the regions of the country the first day of this unit. There's the Haymarket Square Riot and the Pullman Strike, which is in your text as well. Make sure you know that one. The Homestead Strike is there. The Great Railroad Strike is across this region as well. So as we can see, labor unrest is largely limited to the industrialized Northeast. Now, one of the last things I'll leave you with is this cartoon, which I think is fantastic. All right, this cartoon is titled The Tournament of Today. Today's tournament, a showdown between labor and monopoly. All right, and we have our laboring classes right here. Here's this laborer, right? And he's riding this poor donkey. The donkey's titled Poverty. And in his hand is a strike. Right? It's just a stupid little mallet. Right? And behind him are these big old groups of the working class. Right? These big groups of everyday people and kids, and they're a little disheveled looking, a little rowdy. And he's fighting against this giant iron horse, right? Which is, of course, not a donkey. This horse of monopoly, right? And this guy's got freaking armor on. He obviously is quite well off. He's rich. He has a shield, which is entitled "The Corruption of the Legislature." Corruption of the legislature. His spear says "the subsidized press." Right? Subsidized, of course, as you remember, subsidies are government support for. So government paid for the press, government supported press. And his plume is just of arrogance. And behind him are these other rich people. They're all well dressed, right? They're in color. These guys are all in drab colors. Right? It says reserved for capitalists. And I think this cartoon does a really good job of demonstrating like the problems in that like if your only weapon in fighting against monopolies and industrialists is just a strike, that's not sufficient enough to actually enact the type of change that the laboring classes desire. Right? And this goes right back to the quote that I included at the very top of your handout, which says, "The only counterweight to capitalism is government." The only counterweight to capitalism is government. Labor wants to be the counterweight, but cannot. Labor wants to be the counterweight, but cannot. And when you think of like counterweights, right? Like if you're on a seesaw, right? If these two dudes were on a seesaw, it would be like this, just right? Because the monopoly is way heavier, way more powerful than labor. Right? So labor wants to be the counterweight to balance things out with capital, but it cannot because it's not powerful enough. So the only thing that can really level things out, according to that caption, is the government. The government's the only thing that can level the playing field between labor and industry. But as you see, as you know from this era, from this time period, the government just chooses to not. Generally speaking, this is because the government supports big business. Right? Both Republicans and Democrats, to some extent, are unwilling to get involved to actually regulate business. Republicans because they're in favor of big business. Democrats because they're in favor of small government. Thus, neither party is going to be really willing to get into the business of regulating business. Strikes, if that's your most effective, your most powerful weapon, are not overly effective because over time, the ownership class will start just banning union activity, forcing workers to sign what are called yellow dog contracts, which means you can have this job, but you have to sign this contract saying you won't join a union. Placing injunctions, which are like court orders that you can't strike on workers. So throughout this time period, these labor unions are going to attempt to create change, but it will take several decades for unions to actually gain the ground that they want. And then I ask you to just consider what's going to be necessary for the working classes to really have enough credibility to start having some inroads made on some of this change. The last thing I'll show you is this cartoon, which is a good one, which is arguing that here these labor unions are, but they're really being controlled behind the scenes by anarchists. Right? And this is something we still see to this day in our public discourse today, is that when the working classes are asking for maybe a higher minimum wage, maybe better health benefits, maybe universal health care, right? The argument is always like, oh, that's just, you can't do that because it's socialist, it's socialism, that's communism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just a good reminder that some of the arguments against the working class advances today are the same things that we see during the Industrial Revolution. I will leave you here. Your SAQ assessment is quite good. It's a good cartoon that I think is quite eye-opening in terms of the reality of life in the Gilded Age. Answer it. It's good practice. Might prepare you well for your Period 6 test. Have a great day. Thank you for your time. I hope this was helpful in understanding the way in which society responds to industrialization. Bye, y'all.